you watch these TikTok videos right here and you're like my sister questioning whether or not the government is poisoning us, then this video is most definitely for you. Now, ultimately speaking, the three that are showing up on TikTok the most are bananas, avocados, and watermelons, but we can commonly see this in so many different other fruits and vegetables. And it actually comes down to three different factors. First one being excessive amounts of plastic inside of your fruits and vegetables. Half the crowd just was like, goodbye. Okay, so when it comes to texture, we use something called a penetrometer. The Geek Crew, and if you want to join the Geek Crew, it's literally just hitting that subscribe button down there. Costs you absolutely nothing, but pure enjoyment. Oh, it doesn't cost you enjoyment. Well, I mean, it might cost you enjoyment. I don't know. So, penetrometer is stuck into the fruit and vegetable to determine what texture it is or the density of the texture to tell you whether or not you're going to like the fruit or vegetable. And there are three things that ultimately affect how that rolls out. Okay, so number one is actually cell wall modification. Now, this sounds scary and it sounds GMO and hokey pokey, but it's really not. What it actually comes down to is what the plant naturally does as it begins to ripen. So we know there's a trigger point between where you can harvest and it won't ripen properly, get some storage out of it and it will ripen properly. And then obviously what we do here in our gardens is allow it to go almost into deterioration mode and then consume it. And this is what is in most cases, the best flavor and the best texture. Now, cell wall modification is a fancy term for essentially as a tomato or a watermelon becomes ripe, these cells themselves, the cells begin to decompose in a sense and almost explode and deteriorate, which makes the texture of said watermelon more tasty, much easier, crumbly in your mouth, if you will. And a great example of this is actually peaches, nectarines, plums, things like that. Peach, for example, that is not yet ripened. It's really hard. The texture's totally off. But if you wait, it gets kind of mushy, melt in your mouth, delicious. And this is because of cell wall deterioration. Essentially, things are just falling apart, and that's what makes things a little bit more gummy. It's like Mother Nature's way of pre-chewing it and feeding us like we're little baby birds. Number two is actually turgor pressure. So essentially what turgor pressure is, it's the process of water being uptaken into something called a vacuole. The vacuole is inside of a cell, and the cell on the outside of your plants is almost like a balloon. The vacuole inside is a balloon inside of said balloon, and the vacuole will shrink and increase as water comes into and out of the plant. So if a plant is uptaking a lot of water, it begins to expand, which in turn kind of expands the outer balloon. When the plant loses too much water, the vacuole will collapse, and then in turn, the cell wall will collapse with it. Now, remember how cell walls are very important in the process of making a firm fruit or vegetable or plant? Well, if the cell walls have not deteriorated yet, that obviously causes issues. But if the cell walls aren't allowed to expand to the amount that they need to make said texture, the said texture that we want, you're going to end up with a plant that's not too delicious. Now, because plants and, watermelons, it's in the name. There's a ton of water inside of these things. So because vacuoles are so reliant on water, if water is limited, such as a drought season or really high heats where you just simply couldn't ever apply enough water, we tend to get vacuoles that are shrunken and therefore a cell wall that is also shrunken and just something that doesn't have a lot of juice in it. So that's number one. Number two is the opposite of that. And sometimes we see this in the garden, and that's when a tomato plant fills their vacuoles up too much because we keep on giving them water, and eventually they split, and you'll see this every once in a while. That is a vacuole cell walls that have begun to expand past the level that they're meant to and ultimately cause rips and tears inside of the fruit or vegetable. Now, as a producer, you're trying to aim somewhere in between the two because obviously both ends of the spectrum don't yield you much money and kind of turns people off from wanting to eat bananas. Now, keep in mind that water also moves around carbohydrates and nutrients and all that fun stuff throughout the entire plant. And if we're in a drought or we have lack of water, the carbohydrates and the byproducts of photosynthesis also aren't moving around, and a huge part of what makes up the flavor actually comes from the process of photosynthesis. So if your plant's lacking water, it's not able to get things in the right place, your fruits and veggies, your vegetables are going to taste. Okay, so the last one is actual cuticle. So the cuticle on the outside of your fruit and vegetable is almost like a protective barrier that helps decrease or limit turgor pressure. Now, the idea here is that if it can regulate turgor pressure in some way, it can obviously affect the texture of the fruit. Now, so this is obviously something that's not heavily affected by environment. It is affected by, really high heats, for example, or really cold colds, but ultimately, it's a little bit more difficult and not as important in its role compared to the vacuoles and the cell walls. But if it's not present or it's not there in the correct proportions, we tend to get a off texture. The watermelons you are seeing on TikTok are something called woody or woody textured watermelons. And the only reason that these exist actually comes down to the lack of water. So if you didn't get the memo, North America is in a little bit of a drought. I didn't get the memo. Saskatchewan didn't get the memo because it will not stop raining here. Manitoba won't stop raining. Alberta won't stop raining. It just keeps on raining. So those provinces, they didn't get the memo. But the rest of North America, they got the memo. And they are currently in a drought. And obviously with a drought, we are going to have turgor pressures that are going to suffer and cell walls that are going to collapse around said vacuoles and make some very woody watermelons. So that's what's going on with the watermelon. So with bananas and avocados, we're actually suffering from the exact same thing. And that is not cell walls that won't deteriorate and not cuticles that are not at their peak. It actually is vacuoles that aren't expanding fully. So when a plant doesn't expand on its vacuole and really increase the water content, it obviously will make something that is harder and almost plastic-like in a sense. Now, the other reason why this can affect the texture is because the cell wall deterioration can't take place, because if you've watched the videos on soil microbes or just microbes in general, we know microbes need water, and if there's no water or less water present, the process of decomposition is much slower. So think of a semi-dehydrated fruit or vegetable that you buy from the store or you dehydrate on yourself, and how it's shelf stable for quite a long time compared to if you were to put said peach just on the counter as is. It's kind of what's happening with these fruits and vegetables on TikTok. They're in this pseudo-dehydrated state where there's not enough moisture and stuff going on to decompose it quickly anyways, but there's also not enough to make the texture good. So ultimately it just is kind of making some gross produce. Bottom line, welcome to the drought of 2024. You can expect much more of this or just fruits and vegetables that taste like absolute garbage. So this is the reason why you should start a garden. And if you're totally new at that, then you're going to want to check out this video right here. It'll take you through a complete walkthrough of exactly what to expect and how you can go about doing it. It's not too late, I promise you. So talk to you guys next time. Bye.